It's also a community where 2/3 of white people, maybe as many as 70% of white people in 1991 voted for David Duke, white supremacist, former Klan leader, lifelong neo-Nazi, and proud endorser of Donald Trump for president, voted for him in 1991. 70% of the white folks of St. Bernard Parish voted for a Nazi when he ran for governor in 1991. And if you would ask them, who's the source of all the trouble in this city, right, and in this area, because it's different parish, but the New Orleans area, they would have pointed across that road, right, at the lower 9th Ward, and they would have said, those people, right down. They wouldn't have said those people. They'd have said exactly what you think they would have said, right? But here's the grand irony. What was the second hardest hit community when the levees broke? It was St. Bernard Parish. It was Chalmette. It was working class white folks without a pot to piss in. They were the second hardest hit community, which says what? That maybe they'd have been better off, rather than pointing their fingers at the folks across the road and saying they're the problem. They all should have gotten together, marched on Baton Rouge, marched on the Corps of Engineers, marched on Washington, and demanded adequate levee protection. But see, the elite didn't really care about poor black folk or poor white folk. Right. At the end of the day, that is the history of America. It's about rich folk playing off poor black folk and poor white folk. That's what David Duke did in 90 and 91. That was David Duke's entire politic. Right, was telling white people, working class white people, that their problem was black people. He had no plans to solve the problems of that state. The oil industry had collapsed and black people didn't run it, right? The oil industry had collapsed and Mexicans didn't run it, right? The problem was elites making decisions that affected the lives of working people, but it's a lot easier to scapegoat people for problems they didn't create than it is to actually solve the problem. And so those white working class people in Chalmette that got all their stuff destroyed, right, had a commonality of interest with those working class and low-income African-American folk, but they didn't see that, and now it's too late, right? And then they still didn't learn the lesson, because what was the first thing, or one of the first things they did about a year after they got back in session after Katrina, right? They come back into session, the St. Bernard Parish Council. One of the first things, one of the first orders of business, just got the lights back on, just got the water running again, and one of the first things they decided to do is, we need to have a new law. We're going to call it the Blood Relative Renter Law. The blood relative renter law said that you could not rent property in St. Bernard to anyone that wasn't your blood relative. Now, they'd never had this law before. Why would they need this law now? Well, why would a 95% white community have a law like that? Why might they think that that's important? Well, the odds are pretty good that your blood relative's also going to be white. That's a good way to keep black folks out without even running afoul of the Fair Housing Act. Turns out they did run afoul of the Fair Housing Act, and they were busted for it, and they lost the lawsuit over that case. But they tried very hard, still not having learned the lesson that solidarity would have gotten them farther, see? Yeah. And see, that's what we're seeing right now in this presidential race, because that too is the history of America. Rich white people telling working class white people that their problem is brown people. We have seen this movie before. It has been playing for hundreds of years in theater after theater after theater after theater. So we pay attention to, oh, well, my goodness, those Mexicans, they're the reason that you don't have work. Interesting, right? Really, because if you've seen the video from, 3 weeks ago, the Carrier plant in Indiana, right, that was being shut down. Indeed, it is being moved to Mexico, but not because Mexicans made it happen. They're not like a magnet, right? It's not like they have some superpower which they dispense upon the corporate elite of America and cause them, let alone force them, to move their plant. So if you've seen the video, the white dude comes in the nice suit from corporate, right, and he gets up on the podium and he looks at these working class dudes, most of them white guys, right, and he says, by the way, we're moving the plant to Monterrey, Mexico. It was a very hard decision. And the crowd erupts in righteous anger, as they should. The one guy says, was it really hard? It doesn't seem like it was too hard. Other people yell some things I can't repeat, right? But they sound a lot like, surely you jest. Very similar to what I told the guy in the bar, right? It's very obvious that the problem there is not Mexicans, right? Mexicans didn't cut, that was rich white dudes made that decision. Rich white dudes did that. Just like rich white dudes wrecked the economy on Wall Street. That wasn't black people. That wasn't Mexicans, documented or not. That wasn't Asian Americans. It wasn't indigenous people. It sure as hell wasn't Muslims. It was rich white dudes with high SAT scores and MCAT scores and MBA, went to the best colleges. My goodness. And I know we're not supposed to talk about the fact that they were white, because sometimes when I mention that, people get upset. They say, well, that's racist. No, it's observant. And if they had all been black, trust me, somebody would have pointed it out. If black people steal $12.5 trillion of somebody else's money, which is what happened, or not steal it, lose it because of their own incompetence or their unethical machinations, right? If $12.5 trillion goes out the door, which is what happened when Wall Street collapsed. 20% of the accumulated net worth of the United States destroyed in 18 months. If black folks do that, you know black folks not getting banking jobs anymore. Right. Oh, wow, how'd they even get those jobs? Must have been affirmative action. But rich white dudes get them the old-fashioned way, as in daddy made a phone call, and apparently there's not a problem. See, that's worth pointing out. That wasn't people of color, but we're not encouraging working class people to think about the folks at the top who are actually ripping us off or poisoning the water. A lot of working class white folks here in Flint that are reaping the same downside of that neglect, as was the case when the auto industry collapsed as well, right? So in other words, the canaries in the coal mine might be the first ones, but they're not the only ones. It's a precedent for what comes later, and our indifference to that is what sets us up for this kind of pain and allows a demagogue to swoop in, right, and say that I'm going to solve your problems, not by changing the economy that produces those problems. In fact, I'm going to offer more policies that sound a lot like those policies. More tax cuts for wealthy folks, so we'll create a bunch of jobs. But you can't do that when corporate America right now is already sitting on literally something like $6 trillion in cash reserves, between $5 and $6 trillion in cash. Cutting their taxes another trillion is not going to suddenly make them create jobs that they're not creating. Or if they do create jobs, they'll be the kind of jobs they're creating now, which pay 23% less on average than the jobs that were lost during the recession. Right? That's the problem. It's not Mexican folk, it's not black folk, it's not Muslim folk, it's not something that a wall will solve, because after all, a wall isn't going to keep capital from crossing the border. Right? Notice how that works. Capital, all you got to do is hit a button. Capital doesn't have to walk. Just hit a button. So capital will always be allowed to cross border in search of the highest rate of return. I can still stash my money in the Caymans if I had enough money to do that. They wouldn't take my money, but not enough of it, right? But I can still keep my taxes offshore, my profits offshore in a bank, so I have to pay taxes on them. That's what companies do right now. Got hundreds of millions, billions of dollars really parked offshore, even though their profits are being made in this country disproportionately. They're keeping the disproportionate amount of their money in other countries so as to not have to pay taxes on it. That's never going to be illegal. They can cross that border, right? Their goods can cross borders to get the highest price. But labor can't cross borders to get the highest wage. By definition, that is rigging the game in favor of capital and against working people. You want to solve the problem, don't treat the symptom, right? But that's what we have politicians talking about. Let's just treat the symptom. We're going to set fire to the house and then block the exits. That's what the wall is. Let's be clear about that, right? Because in a sense, we set fire to this house when we pass trade agreements like NAFTA. That's setting fire to the house. So one thing that Trump's right about when he talks about trade agreements, he's right. He's just wrong about what to do with it, because ultimately if you set fire to this, is what we did with NAFTA. In case you don't know, NAFTA allowed us to send a bunch of agricultural goods, dump them on the market. So our farmers overproduce certain things, and then the surplus gets dumped in the Mexican market. Now if you dump a bunch of products in a market, what happens? The price of the products go down because they already have plenty of produce themselves. So then Mexican farm workers can't make enough money, right? They can't make the money that they were before. They can't make money for the goods that they take to market. So now they got to go look for work. First place they go is not the United States. First place they go is a big city. So some of them might move toward Mexico City or other large urban areas, but they get there and there's a labor glut. What happens when you have too many people and not enough jobs? Your ability to get a job is impeded. You have to keep moving. There's nothing unique about this in human history. This is always why people move. Nobody moves for fun. That's the great mistake. Everybody seems to think that Mexican folk and Guatemalan folk and Sri Lankan folk and Kenyan folk and all these immigrants, that they're coming to take advantage. Nobody is going to cross an ocean or a border, risk getting shot at, give up everything they have, live in a land with a different language just for fun. Right. People don't even like to move across town. I moved 4 blocks once and I was done. I was like, I'm never doing this again. This was the worst experience of my life. Why would anybody do this? Moving is, like they say, the second most stressful thing next to divorce, right? Nobody does it for fun. Nobody likes it. That's why we hire other people to do all the moving if we have the money. It's like, you come take it. I don't even want to deal with it, you know? So the idea that people would come just to take advantage is nonsense. They come for the same reason that any voluntary migrant, so-called voluntary, because I guess it's not really voluntary when you're desperate. You know, you're sort of just doing what you got to do. Same reason that European people came. It's funny. European folks like to tell this lie, though. Goes back to that point Baldwin was making about not being able to confront history accurately and then not being able to be released from it. White folks like to tell ourselves that our people came here for principles. High-minded principles, by the way, like liberty and justice and freedom. right? But they're coming for stuff. We came for principle. They're coming for stuff. We came for stuff. Let's be clear about that. We didn't come for principles like liberty, because if we had, we would have established some. And that's not what we did. The colonies were like the most unfree place on the planet at that time. It's like one of the most unfree places you could have possibly lived on the face of the earth. And I'm not just talking about the way that the colonists treated indigenous people or African people. That was bad enough. I'm talking about like what we did to each other. Yep. Like white folks spent the better part of the colonial period trying to figure out who the witch was. Right? That's not what a free-minded, liberty-loving people do. Like, you're not a real Christian. Oh, well, you're a warlock. Well, I'm going to burn you in a fire. Well, I'm going to drown you in a stream. Well, I'm going to hang you from a tree. What do you think about that? Liberty-loving, freedom-loving, democracy-loving Englishman, right? That was the colony. This was not about freedom and liberty. This was about stuff. It was about land. It was about opportunity. It was about being able to feed your family. Something else Baldwin said, right, was that the problem was he knew, and all black folks knew, that their people didn't want to come here. White folks still were under the illusion that ours did. And that was the problem, see? Because if you understand that your people didn't want to come either, they came because they had no choice. They were starving. They were desperate. They were hungry. Some of them were convicts. That's why they were indentured servants. They were working off indenture because they had done something illegal. Right? These were not, people always get excited about having come over on the Mayflower. Yeah, my family came over on the Mayflower. All right, sweetheart, you might want to not talk about that so loudly. Like, that's not really a great thing if you knew who was on that boat. Not really sure who was, but I know who wasn't. The king was not on that boat. Nobody that the king particularly wanted to keep around was on that boat. But see, if we don't understand that, and then we look around us and we see this rhetoric aimed at certain immigrants, then we can't understand, we can't see ourselves in them, and we can't see them in us. And if we can't do that,